Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today's day 43, and we're continuing with the instrumental case. And today our topic is a little bit trickier than what we've seen so far, but it's an extremely important one. Basically, it's the use of the instrumental case for predicate nouns and adjectives. So we've got to first discuss what that is, right? What this term predicate even means. It has to do with the position of a word in a sentence, essentially, and how it's being used in the sentence. Our poster reads, "Будь зорким на посту," be vigilant at your post. So here we have a command, right? An imperative, "Будь зорким," be vigilant, right? We want you to play this role of a vigilant person, assume this quality, right? So it's not that it's really a permanent quality of this person, we assume, right? We want him to be that way, right? To play this role, to act this way. And so already here we have an indication of what we'll be talking about today. We have an instance of what I like to call non-identity, right? It's not that this guy has been vigilant from birth or that he's always vigilant, but we want him to be vigilant at a certain time, right? So we have a situation where the subject here of the imperative, right? Hey, you, be vigilant, isn't necessarily, we can't put an equal sign between that and the noun or the adjective that we're using with it. In those instances, Russian highly favors the instrumental. Another poster, "Хочешь быть таким, тренируйся," right? If you want to be like this, train. Okay, so clearly the kid is not like this now. He's just a little kid, right? But if he wants to be a Soviet Superman, then he's going to have to become that, right? He wants to be that. So again, we could say that we can't put an equal sign here between the kid and, being like this. And so we see the adjective takim in the instrumental case. So let's introduce this with a really simple example. It's a somewhat weird one in the sense that you wouldn't normally use this kind of thing in spoken Russian. I mean, you could, but it would be a bit odd. Поезд летел стрелой, right? It sounds kind of literary, almost poetic, right? The train flew like an arrow. So the instrumental can be used, and it often is in poetry, just to make basic, express basic metaphors or similes, right? Now we could say just as easily, "Поезд летел как стрела," right? It flew like an arrow. Or we can express that same idea using the instrumental, right? "Поезд летел стрелой." Now, obviously, we're not saying that the train is literally an arrow, right? So we can't put an equal sign. We can't say that this is an identity statement. It's rather, again, a kind of a metaphor or something like that, right? So that's basically what the predicate is, right? We have a subject, we have a linking verb, and then we have a noun or an adjective, right? And we would call that a predicate noun or a predicate adjective. Now, if the linking verb establishes an identity statement, like A is equal to B, right? For example, my son is a cosmonaut, right? That's a fully, an identity statement in the present tense, right? He is an astronaut or a cosmonaut. Then we put the predicate in the nominative, as we might expect, and we've done that so far in this book, right? So my son is a cosmonaut. But if we have anything short of that, anything short of an identity statement in the present tense, right? What if your son used to be a cosmonaut? What if he wants to become a cosmonaut in the future? Well, now we're falling short of this identity sort of standard. And in those cases, Russian will tend heavily toward the instrumental for predicate nouns and adjectives. So here are several examples. Мой сын будет космонавтом. He will be a cosmonaut. Okay, he's not one now. This isn't an equal sign, so to speak, but he hopes that one day he'll become an astronaut. Мой сын был космонавтом. Same thing. He used to be one. He's not anymore. There's not really an equal sign here in the present tense. Мой сын станет космонавтом. Okay, with an idea literally of becoming an astronaut, then the instrumental is basically just required. It's very clear cut. So if we use the verb in Russian to become, then we're definitely going to follow that with the instrumental. Because obviously he's not a cosmonaut now, he wants to become one. Similarly, мой сын хочет стать космонавтом, right? He wants to become a cosmonaut. And in all those cases, you see instrumental. For example, и я стану механизатором, right? I too will become a farm machinery operator. So here's this verb, becoming, and again, this one, you see how we're marking it up, following it with the kiem chim. That's basically showing us that this verb is always going to be followed by the instrumental, right? Становиться. This is somewhat unusual, by the way, because the imperfective has the reflexive particle, but the perfective doesn't. So that's not a typo. That's just the way this verb works. It's quite unusual. So становиться is an e-verb, right? Становлюсь, становишься, становится, shifting stress, and stать is an in-verb. So we supply the in, we get стану, станешь, станет, etc. We'll see this basic verb here used in a lot of prefixed forms down the road. So it would be great to learn this conjugation here. For example, она станет врачом, she'll become a doctor. Она стала врачом, she became a doctor. Or if we use the infinitive, right, with a modal verb, она хотела стать врачом, we still get the same instrumental case usage. We could also use to become with adverbs. For example, нам стало легко читать по-русски. It became easy for us to read in Russian. Okay, so let's try a few of these with professions, right? And say things like, he who studies psychology will become a psycholog. Okay, so with this verb of becoming, we definitely need instrumental. There's no doubt about that. So let's practice these case forms. Тот, кто изучает психологию, станет психологом. Number two, he who studies, or one who studies philosophy will become a philosopher. Тот, кто изучает философию, станет философом. 3. Тот, кто изучает медицину, станет врачом. Right? One who studies medicine will become a doctor. 4. One who studies law will become a lawyer, jurist. There are different words for lawyer. Jurist is maybe the most general word for anyone involved in the law. Anyway, тот, кто изучает право, станет юристом. 5. Тот, кто изучает историю, станет историком, right, an historian. 6. Тот, кто занимается спортом, может стать спортсменом, right? One who does sports may become, right, possibly, an athlete. 7. Тот, кто изучает журнализм, станет журналистом, right, a journalist. 8. Тот, кто изучает пение, станет... Okay, now, so one who studies singing. By the way, pienie is a verbal noun from the verb piet, which we've learned. And so we're going to learn how this word pienie was formed when we get to book 3. But basically, it's a noun from the verb piet. And then we have two, right, a male and female version for singers, right? Pivets, that has a mobile vowel, so we get pivtsom, right? Or pivitsi, right? So a male singer or a female singer. Pivtsom, pivitsi. 9. Тот, кто играет в футбол, может стать футболистом, right? A football player, soccer player. 10. Тот, кто играет в хоккей, может стать хоккеистом, right? They may become a hockey player. 11. Тот, кто изучает биологию, станет биологом. Okay. Now another verb, which again is basically always followed by the instrumental, is the verb for seeming. So there's a really useful verb. Казаться, показаться. Those are a verbs, right? So they work like сказать, right? Кажусь, кажешься, кажется. They always take the reflexive particle. And so we say that something seems to be something. Now think again, why is the instrumental being used? Because it's not that the thing is whatever, but that it seems to be. It's appearing to be something. So that explains very nicely, right? It's a non-identity statement. That's why we're getting the instrumental. And we say in Russian, kind of like in English, we say something, it seems to me that. We get a dative also in Russian to tell to whom something or for whom something seems to be something. Right? So again, look how we're marking that up in the table here. Казаться кому чем, right? To seem to be something, instrumental, to someone, that's dative. For example, он мне всегда казался странным. He always seemed strange to me. Or он мне показался странным, perfective. He struck me as strange, we might say. He seemed strange to me on a kind of one-time, speaking of a one-time impression. Now again, look at the contrast between seeming and being, right? Эта книга кажется интересной, но на самом деле она скучная. Okay, so the first example with казаться, we're talking about how it seems to be, but in the second clause there, we're saying how it actually is, and we're talking about what we regard at least as a permanent feature of the book, right? A quality of the book, a kind of identity statement. It is boring. And so there we stick with the nominative. Он показался мне идиотом. He struck me as being an idiot. He seemed to be an idiot. Here's a poster. Враг коварен, будь начеку. The enemy is cunning, be on guard. So we could say here, provide a little caption. Снаружи враг кажется овцой, а внутри он волк. Right, so from the outside, the enemy seems to be a sheep, right? Овцой, that's the instrumental of овца. But on the inside, he's a wolf. And there again, with volk, we're using the nominative because the enemy is indeed a wolf. Okay, another verb that takes the instrumental. Again, we can regard this really as a rule, to turn out to be something. Okay, now this one maybe is a bit weird because it does in a way express an identity statement in the sense that this is what the thing truly is. But we might imagine that, we thought it was one thing earlier and then it turned out to kind of show its true colors later. So I guess we can maybe somehow imagine that as being a little bit different from simply stating as a fact what something is. Okay, at any rate, this verb оказываться, казаться, is also followed by the instrumental, and it means something like to turn out to be something, to prove to be something, right? A famous poster here, болтать врагу помогать, right? To babble is to help the enemy, loose lips sink ships. And we see that this guy looks like a normal Soviet citizen, but we can easily tell from his monocle and his evil mustache there that he's a German spy, right? A Nazi spy. And if we supplied a caption here, показался обычным советским человеком, но оказался немецким шпионом. Right? He seemed to be an ordinary Soviet person, whatever, instrumental, but he proved to be a German spy. So here, both of these predicate nouns, right? Человеком, шпионом, are in the instrumental. For example, задача показалась простой, но оказалась очень трудной. The problem seemed simple, but proved to be very difficult. And again, both predicate adjectives there in the instrumental. Now we could follow up оказывается with a что clause, right, with a that clause, and in that case we would abandon the instrumental, right? Оказывается, что эта задача ужасно трудная, right? It turns out that this problem is terribly difficult, right? There, in the clause itself, we have just an understood linking verb, right? Basically an understood есть. So again, we stick with the nominative there for the predicate adjective. Okay, so let's fill in a few more instrumental forms. Сначала моя комната показалась маленькой, но она оказалась большой. Right, at first my room seemed small, but it turned out to be big. I won't ask how that happened, but whatever. Number two, на первый взгляд он может показаться странным, но на самом деле он хороший. Right, at first glance he may seem strange. He may strike one as strange, but in fact he's good. He's a good person. Okay, number three, I love the false dichotomy there between strange and good. Right? Okay, I wrote these, so I don't know why I'm critiquing them, but whatever. Well, I know why, because samakritika, right? Samakritika is essential for being a good communist, right? So we should always practice samakritika, self-criticism, right? I don't know if I've talked about that before in this series, but if you're asking the question, can I do better? Can I do more? Can I work harder? The answer is always yes, right? Okay, number four. Оказалось, что он очень веселый человек. Sorry, I skipped one. Number three. Сначала его книга показалась интересной, но на самом деле она скучная. Right, at first his book seemed interesting, but in fact it's boring. It turned out that he's a very merry person, right? He's a fun person. He's fun-loving. Но сначала он казался грустным, but at first he seemed sad. 5. Оказывается, что русский ужасно трудный язык, right? It turns out that Russian is a terribly difficult language. А сначала он казался таким простым, right? And at first it seemed so simple. I'm not sure that's true either, but whatever. I'm just trying to make up examples here. I guess people maybe feel a false sense of elation when they master the Cyrillic alphabet, right? Which, as we know now, isn't really that difficult, right? But that's the easy part of learning Russian. Okay, шесть. Кажется, что она мало занимается. It seems that she doesn't study very much, right? She studies little. Но, может быть, она окажется хорошей студенткой. But maybe she'll prove to be a good student. Okay, 7. Кажется, что он плохо пишет. Но кто знает, он может стать известным писателем. Right? It seems that he writes badly, but who knows, he may become a famous writer. Doesn't sound very likely, but who knows. Okay, by the way, a nice little poslovica there, fairly common. Первый блин комом. It's a really nice example. And by the way, as so many of these little folk sayings go, there's no verb here, right? So we're expressing all sorts of ideas just through the use of case endings, right? Literally the first pancake, that's our subject, nominative, and then sort of as a lump or in the form of a lump or appearing to be a lump, right? Or it turns out to be a lump. It comes out as a lump, right? So all different ways, I guess we could think of why we're getting the instrumental here. And it's the Russian here is very, very simple, but very descriptive, right? The first pancake always comes out just looking like a shapeless, unappetizing lump. And I'm sure at some point, if you go to Russia, you'll get practice making Russian pancakes. This is almost always the case. Even if you're quite good at making pancakes, that first one just doesn't come out very well. Either the pan isn't hot enough or just whatever is the deal. It just never seems to work out, that first one. Okay, so we've looked at several verbs now that basically always take the instrumental. Let's talk more about the verb быть, right? But just our basic linking verb. That's maybe a bit more tricky, right? A couple of posters here. Ты тоже будешь героем. You too will be a hero. Okay, note future tense, right? So when we talk about the verb being, we're looking for whether or not we have an identity statement in the present tense, right? If we shift to the future or the past, right, the thing no longer is this thing. It may become it. It may used to have been whatever, and now it's something else or whatever. So in those cases, we would tend toward the instrumental, right? Ты будешь героем. You will be a hero, right? Okay, more examples. Она станет врачом. Okay, there's with the verb to become. Now, if we think about it, if we just use the future tense, она будет врачом, it's really logically saying almost the same thing, right? She's not a doctor right now. She will be one in the future, and that implies becoming, right? So that's one way to maybe think about this use of the instrumental in the future. Now, again, if we insert a verb like wanting, nothing really changes. Она хочет стать врачом. Она хочет быть врачом. Right? She wants to be a doctor, but she's not one now. Okay, so here are some examples in the past. Когда я был маленьким, я любил бегать в парке. When I was little, okay, I'm not anymore, right? Когда я была маленькой, я любила бегать в парке. Okay, so there's just the female version of that. When I was little. Right, we could say something very similar with a noun, right? Like, let's take ребенок, right? When I was a child, I'm not anymore, right? Когда я был ребенком, я любил бегать в парке. Or future tense, ты скоро будешь отцом. Трудно поверить. Right? Soon you'll be a father, you'll become a father, hard to believe. Look at this girl. Буду химиком. I will become a chemist. I will be a chemist. Okay, yeah, so there's some discussion prompts there on 224 if you'd like to practice this a little bit. So let's look at some more examples. Another poster, буду машинистом, I'll be a train conductor. Okay, so let's talk about professions quickly. Моя мама врач, my mom is a doctor. Okay, so that's an identity statement, present tense, so that makes perfect sense. Now, another way to say the same thing in Russian, sort of an idiom, моя мама работает врачом. My mom works as a doctor. Okay, so that's, again, you can choose between those two statements, but you can't mix and match, right? So you wouldn't say моя мама врачом, right? You would say моя мама врач or она работает врачом. Now look at some imperatives, right? Моя мама была врачом, right? Past tense. Again, we talked about that already. Моя дочка будет врачом. And even as we saw at the very beginning of the lesson, right? Even if we gave an imperative, like we tell someone to be an adjective or to be something, it doesn't matter, noun or adjective. Well, the implication is that they're not being that right now, right? We want them to act that way. We want them to become that way, whatever it may be. So with imperatives as well, we can get the instrumental будь врачом. Okay, now sometimes you may see, again, we can't really call this a rule. Now, I like to point out here that, with some Slavic languages, like let's take Polish, for example, all predicate nouns and adjectives in Polish are in the instrumental. So it's just basically a grammatical rule. In Russian, it's not quite that simple. As we've seen, first of all, in the present tense, you usually do get the nominative. And even in, say, the past tense or the future tense, you may not always see the instrumental. So this is something I think at this stage just to watch out for. And just to remember that we could speak of this as a very strong tendency, but there may be instances where both nominative or instrumental could be possible. Now, especially when we're describing kind of permanent qualities, right? Она была красивой may sort of sound like, well, she was once beautiful, or back in the day she was really beautiful. Maybe she's not anymore. But, another way to think about that really is that, back in the day she had this permanent feature of being beautiful. That's who she was. However we choose to think about this, you could see either. Она была красивая. Now, one final note. This is kind of not used all the time in spoken Russian, but a formal way to say to be is the verb являться, which is an I verb. And you'll hear this quite a bit in formal Russian, like on the news or whatever. And so you'll say things like, he is the president, right? Он является президентом. So this is basically a way to supply a verb, a linking verb, even where you wouldn't normally use есть. Okay, so at any rate, when you use this verb являться, it always takes the instrumental. Okay, and again, that may seem a bit weird because it is a statement of identity, right? Now, I think maybe one way to explain this is that the verb являться literally has to do with appearing, if we take the literal meaning of the verb, of the root. So that may help explain why we get instrumental here. But again, sometimes we have to stop thinking too much about things and just accept it as a rule. So if you see the verb являться, that's always followed by a predicate noun or adjective in the instrumental. Okay, last thing today is pretty simple. In English, we have this idiom you and I, or he and I, or my brother and I, right? The version of that, the Russian equivalent of that is we with whoever, right? So this is another idiom, right? In English we say he and I. In Russian we would say we with him, we with him. Okay, and as you might expect, the with part in Russian is going to be s plus the instrumental. Right, so in terms of the grammar here, there's nothing really new for us. Мы с ней ходили в кино, right? She and I went to the movies, or literally, we with her went to the movies. Now we would say the subject there really is мы, and so we get a plural verb, as we would expect, ходили. Or my brother and I, literally, we with brother, will soon go to Europe. Мы с братом скоро поедем в Европу. Okay, let's give a few examples here. My sister and I went to the theater. Мы с сестрой ходили в театр. Мы с ней любим оперу. Right? She and I love opera. Мы с ней. Number 2, my father and I were at the stadium. Мы с отцом были на стадионе. Мы с ним любим смотреть футбол. Right? He and I love to watch soccer. Now, by the way, here, when we're repeating these phrases, it's a bit of overkill because we know now who we're talking about. So we could just simply say мы, right? Because we know we're talking about me and dad, or dad and I, right? But anyway, this is just for practice, right? Number 3, мы с соседом занимались весь вечер, right? My neighbor and I, we with neighbor, were studying all evening. He and I study physics. Мы с ним изучаем физику. 4, my wife and I went to college together. Мы с женой учились вместе, right? We using here this verb учиться, which we learned means to go to college, to study. Мы с женой учились вместе. Мы с ней познакомились там. Right? Мы с ней там познакомились. 5. My family and I were outside the city at the dacha. Мы с семьей были за городом на даче. Okay, so that's it for today. And again, this lesson today is really important because as we start reading Russian literature, we're going to see this use of the instrumental all over the place. And again, it can be a little bit hard to get a handle on. Again, in part because this isn't necessarily a rule, but it's a very, very strong tendency. So the guidelines we gave today will hold up usually very nicely, but do watch out for certain exceptions. Okay, that's it for today. Until next time, до свидания, товарищи.